Now this is one of the best, strongest, and fastest Spark Sorceress build for endgame in POE 2. With this build you can easily full clear tier 16 maps fully juiced in around 5 to 10 minutes depending on the map layout, and get tons of exalted orbs or divine orbs. This build is also extremely cheap to make, as all my gear combined costs less than 50 exalted orbs or less than 1 divine orb. Now for the Sorceress ascendancies, I did choose the Chronomancer ascendancy, but this build will also work for the Stormweaver ascendancy as well with some minor tweaks. And the reason my gear is so cheap is because some of my gear has armor and not purely energy shield. I have spent 1 exalted orb per gear for most of my gear, and at most you will spend around 5 exalted orbs for majority of your gear. I'm going to showcase the skills, gear, and passive skill tree to easily dominate the endgame, but there are some advanced tips that will make this build stronger, so I highly recommend you to watch this video from the beginning to the end to see how everything synergizes. So let's check this out. So first I'm going to show you easily clearing tier 16 maps fully juiced. I would clear this tier 16 map faster if one of the suffix on the map wasn't for 50% monster elemental resistance. This map also has a boss and it's irradiated, so it has +1 to monster level. So really this is a tier 17 map. Now as of right now I'm level 88 and can easily clear tier 16 maps in around 5 to 10 minutes depending on the map layout. This build can easily destroy groups of enemies and melt bosses. With this build I am building critical hit chance and critical damage to greatly increase my damage. I'm also gaining the effect Arcane Surge whenever I deal critical damage because of 3 nodes on the passive skill tree, and Arcane Surge will greatly increase your mana regeneration and cast speed. Now since I'm not purely building energy shield and my pieces of gear has armor and or energy shield, all the pieces of gear will be extremely cheap, so you can easily make this build. Now the main skill for this build will be Spark to easily destroy enemies on the entire screen, and your mana will also be your health, because with this build you'll be picking the node Mind Over Matter on the passive skill tree. But I'll go over everything in more details in their dedicated sections, and I'll have the full build layout and a build planner in the description below. Okay, so next for the skills. Now only my Spark skill is 6 links and the rest of my skills are at most 4 links. But if your Spark skill is only 4 or 5 links, I'll let you know what support skills to remove until you upgrade your Spark skill. And some of the skills I just added some random support skills because you will have extra slots. So the first skill I'm using is Spark, and this is our main damage dealing skill, able to easily destroy enemies on the entire screen and melt bosses. And this skill will spray sparkling lightning projectiles that travel on the entire screen. I paired this skill with acceleration to increase its projectile speed to reach enemies faster. I'm also using persistence to increase the skill effect duration, and inspiration to have this skill cost less mana, because if you don't have a lot of mana regeneration, this skill will drain all your mana. So these support skills will be the main support skills you want to have first. The next support skill you want to use is considered casting, which will greatly increase your damage, but in return it will decrease your cast speed. And the last support skill you want is arcane tempo, because this will greatly increase your cast speed for more damage. But just be aware that using this support skill will quickly drain your mana if you don't have high mana regeneration. The next skill I'm using is Orb of Storms, and this skill will create an orb that electrifies and fires chain lightning bolts at nearby enemies. Now I mainly use this skill on rare enemies that have lightning resistance and on bosses, because just using Spark will do enough damage to clear the entire screen with enemies. I paired this skill with Lightning Exposure to inflict lightning exposure on shocking enemies, and then Strip Away to increase the effect of lightning exposure, and then Overcharge to increase the magnitude of shocks, but in return decrease the shock duration. The next skill I'm using is Mana Tempest, and this skill will create a storm around you that greatly increases your damage of your other skills. Now you will rarely use this skill, as this skill drains tons of mana, and having mana is important because mana will also be your life because of the node Mind Over Matter on the passive skill tree. I will only use this skill on bosses when the bosses are stunned or frozen, and I know I have time to recover my mana, so be aware it's risky when using this skill. I paired this skill with Premeditation to increase my other skills damage when using this skill, and Unbreakable to increase my stun threshold when using this skill. Now you don't have to have Unbreakable, and I just added it because I have an extra slot. The next skill I'm using is Archmage, and this is a passive skill that adds extra lightning damage to your spells to greatly increase your damage based on your mana, but in return your skill will cost more mana. And I paired this skill with Lightning Mastery to increase this skill's level for more damage. And the next skill I'm using is Conductivity, and this skill will curse targets, lowering the enemy's lightning resistance. And this skill is really strong against enemies that have lightning resistance and on bosses. I also have this skill on weapon set 2, so I can get bonus stats on the passive skill tree. But I'll go over weapon set 2 when going over the advanced tips in another section in this video. And I paired this skill with heightened curse to increase the effect of the curse, and focus curse to curse enemies more quickly. The next skill I'm using is flame wall, and this skill will create a wall of fire that ignites and deals damage to enemies. Any projectiles that is fired through the firewall will add fire damage and also ignite enemies. Now this skill is just to add some extra damage against bosses, and I rarely use this skill because just using spark itself will do tons of damage. I paired this skill with fortress to create the firewall in a circle, and then fire mastery to increase the level of this skill, and then spell cascade to cover the entire screen with firewall. But like I mentioned before, just using spark will do more than enough damage to clear the entire screen of enemies, and firewall can be used to add some extra damage against bosses. The next skill I'm using is blink, and this is a passive skill that will replace your dodge roll with a short teleport, but blink will have a cooldown. Now I'm using this skill on weapon set 2 to have enough spirit to use this skill and remove the archmage skill from weapon set 2. And blink is really useful for speed running maps and also getting out of dangerous situations, so you want to get comfortable in switching weapons to use this skill. And I paired this skill with vitality, which will regenerate your life, but I just added this support skill because I have extra slots for this skill. The next skill I'm using is sigil of power, and this skill is coming from my second weapon, so you will want to have a staff with this skill for weapon set 2. And this skill will place a sigil on the ground that will increase your spell's damage, and this skill is really strong on bosses to increase your damage. I paired this skill with magnifying effect to increase the area effect, and mobility to reduce the movement speed penalty when using this skill. Now the next two skills I'm using are the ascendancy skills from the Chronomancer. So the next skill I'm using is temporal rift, and this skill will basically time travel you back to a previous location and resetting your life, mana, and energy shield at that time. This is a really strong survivability skill, allowing you to regain your life and mana if you take damage. And I paired this skill with ingenuity to lower its cooldown, so you can constantly cast this skill if you're in a dangerous situation. And the last skill I'm using is time freeze, and this skill will freeze all the enemies on the entire screen. This skill is really strong for offense and defense depending on your situation. With this skill you can easily freeze bosses and do tons of damage without worrying about the boss's mechanics. And for defense, this skill is really strong if you get surrounded by enemies, so you can easily freeze the enemies around. I paired this skill with second wind to be able to have another charge for emergency, but in return this skill will have a 50% less cooldown recovery rate. Then I paired this skill with life tap to convert the mana cost to life, because I'm using the node mind over matter on the passive skill tree, and if you get surrounded by enemies and they drain all your mana, you can still use this skill to get out of a dangerous situation. And I also paired it with wind wave that triggers a blast of wind that knocks back enemies if you get stunned while using this skill. Now wind wave is just a random support skill I added because I have an extra slot on this skill. Okay, so that's all the main skills I'm using for this build, and depending on what weapon set you're using, you will have access to your other skills, and I'll have the full skill layout in a build planner in the description below. Okay, so next for the gear. Now since I'm getting armor for this build and not just purely energy shield, the price for the gear is extremely cheap. Most of the gear I have, except for my main weapon, I was able to buy for 1 exalted orb and at most 5 exalted orbs, but my main weapon did cost 20 exalted orbs. Now for the gear, the main base stats you want for your gear is armor and or energy shield for the gear to be extremely cheap, because if you get purely energy shield gear, then you'll be expecting to spend 100 exalted orbs or tons of divine orbs. And for the stats, you want to first max out all your elemental resistance, because maxing out your resistance will allow you to easily survive the end game and not get one-shotted by most attacks. Now on the weapon and offhand, you're looking for mainly spell level, damage, and cast speed. And on your armor pieces and jewelry, once you max out all your elemental resistance, you're looking for mana regeneration, max mana, max life, damage, and intelligence. And I did use a Vol orb and corrupt all my gear, and some of my gear when I corrupted them got better, but some of the gear did get worse. So just be aware that corrupting your gear is risky, and I'll have my full gear layout in a build planner in the description below. So starting with the weapon, I'm using a wand so I can use an offhand, and this is the only piece of gear that was slightly expensive, costing 20 exalted orbs. And for the stats, I have damage as extra fire damage, increased spell damage, maximum mana, level 2 all lightning spell skills, increased critical hit chance for spells, and mana regeneration. Now you also want to get increased cast speed, but if you do, it will be very expensive and you will be spending divine orbs. So you want to shop around, and you'll need to lose a key stat on some of your gear in order for the price to be extremely cheap. Next, for the offhand, I'm using a focus, and the stats I have is increased spell damage, increased cold damage, maximum mana, increased cast speed, intelligence, and mana regeneration. Now you'll also want level 2 all spell skills, but just like the weapon, I didn't add this key stat, so the price of this focus was extremely cheap. But you can shop around and switch some stats around for a better focus. Next, for the helmet, the stats I have is armor, maximum energy shield, increased armor and energy shield, maximum mana, intelligence, cold resistance, and life regeneration. And because I'm not getting purely energy shield, this helmet was cheap and will be the same for all the other armor pieces. Next, for the body armor, the stats I have is armor, maximum energy shield, increased armor and energy shield, maximum life, strength, lightning resistance, and chaos resistance. Next, for the gloves, the stats I have is increased armor, adds lightning damage to attacks, maximum life, cold resistance, lightning resistance, and chaos resistance. Next, for the boots. Now for the boots, the stats movement speed is important, and you want either 25% or 30% movement speed. And the stats I have is maximum energy shield, increased energy shield, fire resistance, and chaos resistance. Next, for the belt, the stats I have is reduced charm charges used, maximum life, increased flash life recovery rate, increased charm effect duration, fire resistance, lightning resistance, and chaos resistance. Next, for the amulet, the stats I have is life regeneration, increased spell damage, maximum energy shield, maximum mana, intelligence, lightning resistance, and mana regeneration. Now for the first ring, the stats I have is chaos resistance, increased chaos damage, maximum life, maximum mana, intelligence, fire resistance, mana regeneration, and increased light radius. And for the second ring, the stats I have is fire resistance, increased chaos damage, maximum life, maximum mana, dexterity, all elemental resistance, and gain life per enemy killed. And for the charm, I'm using a golden charm to increase the rarity of items found when you kill a rare or unique enemy. And for the life flask, I have instant recovery, but in return the recovered amount is reduced by 50%. Now the instant recovery is very helpful even if you're losing the recovered amount, because you can always spam your life flask, and with this build your mana will be drained when taking damage before life, so you will be barely using your life flask. And for the mana flask, I have increased the amount recovered, because with this build you have tons of mana, but with this build you should have tons of mana regeneration to sustain your mana. Now for weapon set 2, I'm using a staff that has the skill Sigil of Power. Now for the staff, you're only looking for the skill Sigil of Power, and the stats on the staff does not matter, because you will be immediately switching back to your main weapon when using your other skills. The only time you'll be switching to weapon set 2 is when using the skill Sigil of Power and the curse skill Conductivity to reduce the enemy's lightning resistance, and use other nodes on the passive skill tree that boost your curse skills. You'll be also switching to weapon set 2 when using the blink skill. And lastly, for the sockets for your gear, on my focus I'm using runes that increase my mana regeneration, and on all the armor pieces I'm using runes to increase my resistance to cap out all my elemental resistance. So if you check out my stats, you can see all my resistance is capped out at 75%. Now I was able to find this unique amulet, the Everlasting Gaze, and you can use this amulet if you need more mana regeneration, but my current amulet I have equipped has better stats, and I don't need the extra mana regeneration and energy shield. And this unique amulet is expensive, so getting the amulet I have currently equipped will be a lot cheaper. Okay, so that's the full gear layout for this build, and all the pieces of gear I have currently equipped cost less than 50 exalted orbs, because I am sacrificing some key stats for this build, and I will have my full gear layout in a build planner in the description below. Okay, and next for the passive skill tree. Now for the passive skill tree, I did focus on getting critical hit chance and critical damage, and I took 3 nodes that grant Arcane Surge when getting a critical hit, which will greatly increase your cast speed and mana regeneration. And my passive skill tree is slightly different when using weapon set 2 to gain additional bonuses when using the curse skill Conductivity. So first I headed this way to gain spell damage, and I took raw power to greatly increase my spell damage and intelligence. Then I headed right this way to get practice signs to increase my cast speed. Then I headed up this way to increase my critical hit chance with spells, and took critical overload to increase my critical hit chance with spells and increase my spell damage if I dealt a critical hit recently. Then continuing up and then going left this way, I took sudden escalation to greatly increase my critical hit chance with spells and to increase my cast speed if I dealt a critical hit recently. Then heading over here and first going left this way, I'm using this jewel, and jewels overall are very powerful. You want to take all the jewel nodes you're close to, because jewels will greatly boost your stats. And for the stats on the jewels, jewels, you're looking for either spell damage, elemental damage, cast speed, mana regeneration, critical hit chance, and or critical hit damage. So for this jewel, the stats I have is spell damage, critical hit chance, and mana regeneration. Then continuing heading left and going up this way, I took these nodes to increase my mana regeneration, and I took adverse growth, which damage taken is recouped as mana, but in return your life regeneration is reduced. Then you want to head this way and get this node, mind over matter, where all damage is taken from mana before life, but in return your mana regeneration rate is reduced by 50%. And this node is really strong for survivability, where you won't get one-shotted by most enemies' attacks. Then heading up this way, you want to take these nodes. These nodes are really important because these nodes will grant you Arcane Surge when you critically hit an enemy, and you want to take Touch of Arcane, which will increase the effect of Arcane Surge, and these nodes here will also increase the effect of Arcane Surge. Then you want to take this jewel node, and on this jewel I have spell damage, critical hit chance, and mana regeneration. Then heading back here and heading this way, I took these nodes to increase my elemental damage, and took all natural to increase all elemental resistance and greatly increase my elemental damage. Then continuing this way, I took these nodes to increase my cast speed, and took storm charge to greatly increase my elemental damage if I dealt a critical hit recently, and to increase my critical hit chance. Then coming back here and heading down this way, I'm using this jewel that has spell damage, critical hit chance, and mana regeneration. Then heading this way, I took these nodes to increase my mana regeneration, and this node Aspiring Genius is important because this will greatly increase your mana regeneration, but most importantly you will gain Arcane Surge when you deal a critical hit. I also took this node Mind Eraser to increase my mana regeneration, and some damage taken is recouped as mana. Now heading all the way back here and now going right this way, I'm using this jewel which has the stats spell damage, critical damage bonus, mana on kill, and elemental damage. Then I headed this way to increase my cast speed with lightning skills, and took lightning quick to increase my lightning damage and cast speed with lightning skills. I also took these nodes and branching bolts for my lightning skills to chain an additional time. Then heading this way, I took Eldritch Battery, which will convert all energy shield to mana, which will greatly increase my damage and life. And heading this way, I took these nodes to increase my mana regeneration, and took Arcane Intensity to increase my spell damage per 100 maximum mana. Then heading this way, I took Raw Mana to increase my maximum mana, but in return your skills will cost more mana. Then I headed this way to increase my critical hit chance for spells, and took Controlling Magic, which will greatly increase your critical hit chance with spells and have reduced critical hit chance against you. Then I headed this way, and I'm using this jewel that has spell damage, critical hit chance, and mana regeneration. Then heading up this way, I took these nodes to increase my lightning damage, and took Pure Power to increase my lightning damage per every 10 intelligence. I also took these nodes which damage penetrates lightning resistance, and took Electric Amplification, which damage greatly penetrates lightning resistance and increased lightning exposure effect. Then heading back here and going this way, I took these nodes to increase my cast speed, and took Mental Alacrity to increase my cast speed, mana regeneration, and intelligence. Then I headed up here to use this jewel that has the stats spell damage, cast speed, and mana regeneration. Then I headed down here, and I'm using this jewel that has the stats spell damage, critical damage bonus, mana regeneration, and elemental damage. Then I took these nodes to increase my critical hit chance, and took True Strike to increase my dexterity and greatly increase my critical hit chance. I also headed this way and took For the Jugular to greatly increase my critical damage bonus and intelligence, and headed this way and got Deadly Force to greatly increase my damage if I have dealt a critical hit in the past 8 seconds, and to increase my critical hit chance. Okay, so that's all the nodes I took on the passive skill tree for weapon set 1. Now for weapon set 2, you want to remove all these nodes here, and also remove the nodes here that increases your damage, and get these nodes that will boost your curse skill conductivity. So for weapon set 2, I took these nodes that increase the effect of your curse, and I took Master Hexes that greatly increases the effect of your curse, but your curse duration is reduced. I also took these nodes that increase your curse duration, and took Lingering Whispers that greatly increase your curse duration and increase the effect of your curse. Then for weapon set 2, you want to head this way and get these nodes that increase your curse duration, and took Fated End that greatly increases your curse duration, and enemies that are cursed by you have reduced life regeneration rate, and enemies cursed cannot recharge energy shield. And lastly, you want to take these nodes that increase the effect of your curse and has faster curse activation, and I took Impending Doom, which greatly increases your curse activation, and your curse have 20% increased effect if 50% curse duration expired. Okay, so now for the Chronomancer's Ascendancy points. I have all 8 Ascendancy points, but if you don't have all the Ascendancy points, I will let you know where you want to put your points in order. So for the first 2 Ascendancy points, you want to get Footprints in the Sand to unlock the skill Temporal Rift, which is a really strong skill for survivability. And then the next 2 Ascendancy points, you want to get Ultimate Command to unlock the skill Time Freeze, which is a very powerful skill offensively and defensively. And for the next 2 Ascendancy points, you want to get Apex of Moment to automatically slow enemies around you, which which is really strong for survivability. And the last 2 ascendancy points, you want to head this way and get Quicksand Hourglass to gain 50% more cast speed for 4 seconds for every 12 seconds. Okay, so that's the passive skill tree for this build as of right now. And just be aware your passive skill tree will be slightly different when using weapon set 1 or weapon set 2. And I'll have the full passive skill tree layout in a build planner in the description below. Okay, and lastly, I want to show you some advanced tips for this build to make this build stronger. So first is that you want to use 2 weapon sets. One weapon set will be for your main skills, and the other weapon set will be used to boost your curse skills from your passive skill tree and to be able to use blink. And having the second weapon with the skill Sigil of Power will greatly increase your other skills spell damage when using this skill. So you want to find the staff with the skill Sigil of Power. And in order to set up your weapon set to your skills, you want to go to your skills panel and set your skills to be either be used on weapon set 1 or weapon set 2. And lastly, you want to get comfortable in switching weapons to weapon set 2 in order to use your blink skill if you get into a dangerous situation and you need to create more distance from enemies or bosses. Okay, so thanks for checking out one of the best, strongest, and fastest Spark Sorceress build for endgame in PoE 2. With this build, you can easily full clear tier 16 maps, fully juiced, in around 5 to 10 minutes depending on the map layout. This build can easily destroy enemies on the entire screen and melt bosses. The gear for this build will be extremely cheap because you'll be sacrificing some key stats, but you can easily make this build and farm exalted orbs and divine orbs. I will have the full build layout in a build planner in the description below. Hope this helps, and more PoE 2 videos to come, so stay tuned. And in the end,
there can be no salvation without sacrifice.